Auzu billahi minash shaitanir rajim. Bismillahir rahmanir rahim. Assalamu alaikum. It's a good morning, all of you. Assalamu alaikum again. It's a great pleasure that we are here to look at what is entitled the role of Muslim women during the Prophet's time. In order for us to have a better view of the role and place of women in the community of Islam that developed, what we have to recognize is the social, cultural, and historical context in which the Prophet emerged in Arabia, and the role and place of women in jahiliyah society, and the transformation that the Prophet brought about in that society. When you look at Mecca at the time of the Prophet, and you can see this very clearly in the seerah of the Prophet, you will find that in the jahiliyah days, women were perceived and treated in a certain way by these jahilun of Arabia. In human society, all human beings, regardless of what society they live in, from the most primitive human society to the most high-tech society where you live in now in America, you have three building blocks that go into the making of culture, from the most primitive to the most high-tech, and all the societies in between. All human cultures have material base, value base, and institutional base. The role and place of women in any of these societies, from the most primitive to the most advanced like America today or Canada or any of the developed countries, and all the societies between these two systems, the human beings have a family. That's the most basic, the most primal. When we use the word primitive, people tend to identify with backwardness and anything like that. But the word primitive was not meant that way. It meant the primary, the first thing that happened. Now, we now use the term primal. The first primal human institution was the family, and the family is still around, even though it has been reconceptualized to the point that today, the British Journal of Sociology, one of the British journals, identified that there are 120 types and forms of families. You can understand what has happened, because you see the distortions in Western society with regard to family. Today, if you have two women living together, that's a family. If you have a single mother with 3 kids, that's a family. If you have 2 kids whose parents are dead and they're living with their grandparent, that's a family. I mean, you see, like, that concept of family, of course, is very different from the traditional understanding of our family. Because in all the languages, all the cultures, a family man, a single man who marries a single woman, and they have kids. That was the original meaning of family. But today, because of postmodernism in Western society, and because of these gays and lesbians that are active in Western society, the concept of family has been eroded, and even there is confusion now as to the meaning. This has implication for what we are going to talk about, because when we talk about the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam and his history and seerah, we just should not talk about it in isolation as if it has no meaning, because then he is not an example, because he lives in the past. You have to make that knowledge relevant to what you experience today, so that the past becomes the interpreter of the present, and then you have a dialogue between the past and the present. That has to be. Now, every culture that you look at has these 3 components: the material, the value, and institutional. The family is one of the human institutions, the oldest one. And you can never have a society without a viable family, because a society is a confederation of families coming together. The Jamaat we have here, this camp would not work if the families were not here, working together. Sons listening to fathers, daughters listening to moms, and all the others, uncles and friends and relatives and neighbors. Now, when we talk about women at the time of the Prophet, we have to conceptualize that experience in this manner. that during the time of the Prophet, the Arabs of that period of jahiliyah had a way of looking at man-woman relations, families, and society. Now, in that Arabian society, they had 4 ways of relating to women, man and woman. In all human societies, you had monogamy, what we now call monogamy. So you can see that monogamy has always existed. So when you talk about the role and place of women at the time of the Prophet, you have to know what the Meccans were doing to their women, to their men, and how did they relate to each other, and their society, and how it related to women or the female. Now, monogamy was one of the institutions of marriage that existed in Arabia. But like other human societies, and even today in Africa and Asia, you still have polygyny, or what is called polygamy. That is multiple marriages. So the opposite of monogamy, one man, one wife, one woman, one husband, to one man, many women. That's polygamy. So you have these 2. They existed, and it affected the role and place of women during the time of the Prophet. This 3rd institution that existed among Arabs, and this phenomena was unique in the Arabia of the time of the Prophet. We don't know from anthropology that this kind of system existed, relationship between man and woman existed in other societies. But we know that in Arabian Peninsula, this anthropological construct existed. And what was it? Muta, temporary marriage. That means to say a man can contract a marriage arrangement with a woman, but with the understanding that this is temporary. Now, of course, in a monogamous or polygamous relationship, divorce is always possible in marriages. But this one, you enter the arrangement knowing that you're going to dissolve it. There's no man or woman who marries a woman. I don't know of anybody who marries a woman and a woman marries a man and says, we're going to get divorced. No. They want to marry for life.
What do you think of the green card?
Well, I mean, that's a hoax. That's a fraud. Green card marriages are fraudulent marriages. Those are fraudulent marriages. Now, there are some Muslims who engage in, that's what Brother Sadullah was talking about, injustice. You see, you can postpone your prayer, but you cannot be unjust. A man cannot say, I want to marry an American girl because he knows in his head that he is not sincere. He just wants to have a green card. Now, he may rationalize that in the name of muta, but muta is no longer allowed among Muslims. It was allowable for a time in the history of Muslims, but not now. There are some Muslims, Sunnis especially, who when they want to fight Shiites say, the Shiites practice muta. But even in the Shiite tradition, they don't practice muta. So, I mean, like maybe some extreme groups. Muta was abolished. It was tolerated for a while in the history of Islam, but it was abolished. By the time Umar ibn Khattab became Khalif, it was gone. Muta existed among the pre-Islamic Arabs, to the point that those Arabs, when they see a woman, and because many of them who used to make these long distance travels from Mecca to Damascus, or to Yemen, or to Abyssinia, or any of those surrounding areas in Bahrain and other places, they will engage in these temporary marriages of muta. And that affected women because you don't take their dignity seriously. The 4th kind of relationship that existed between men and women, and this affected the role and place of women during the time of the Prophet, because these were the traditions he found in his society. And the revelation came to oppose some of these practices. And you can see why girls would later be treated differently from boys, to the point that the Arab men of Arabia at the time of the Prophet would rather bury their daughters alive. There was a reason for that, because human beings don't just do things like that. They have a reason for doing that. The 4th arrangement that existed in Arab society, the women with the white flag. Today we call them prostitutes. But you see, the conception that the Arabs of pre-Islamic period had is not like the concept of Las Vegas prostitutes, that they live in one place. No, they have this idea that when a man, you may have friends, they go to the woman with this white flag above her tent. Now, when this woman gets pregnant, prostitutes don't want to get pregnant. But this woman deliberately wanted to get pregnant because they have these friends who are jahilun, but they may be good warriors or good horse riders. They're great fighters. So they want to be the mothers of these warriors. So these guys go and visit them. When they get pregnant and they deliver, the guys will come and look at the baby and they say, oh, this looks like Musa. And Musa is the father. That's what they used to do in Arabia. So you had this monogamous, polygamous, mutha, and relationship with women with the white flag. When Islam came, it found these kind of practices among the Arabians. And the Prophet Muhammad was guided by Allah through the Quranic revelations to abolish some of these practices that existed. And of course, monogamy and polygyny survive. Now, polygamy had no limit. You know that even in the time of Dawood and Sulayman, they had many wives, dozens of wives. But when the Quran came, it put not only a numerical restriction on the number of spouses you can have, but it imposed a psychological condition, which is much more difficult. And that is, you must be fair to the wives if you want to take 2, 3, or 4. That psychological restriction is more burdensome because very few men, if any, are psychologically balanced mentally to maintain 2 wives, much more 4 wives. You see what I'm saying? And of course, that is where the Quran comes down on this psychological restriction. And of course, with the Quranic revelation, the relationship between men and women was defined. Mutha was curtailed, monogamy was encouraged, polygamy was encouraged if you can meet the numerical and the psychological conditions. And of course, our scholars have written dozens, thousands of books on these issues. Now, when we talk about the role and place of women during the time of the Prophet, we also have to understand the Arab concept of nobility. They have this idea of murwa, and which affected them in terms of their relationship with one another, to the point that the Arab was so concerned about his image and his sense of nobility that when his enemy is being chased by another person who may not be his enemy, but his enemy comes into his tent, he would rather be killed by the enemy of his enemy than to let that enemy who was willing to kill him just 2 hours ago die in his tent. That was an Arab attitude, which was very interesting, in the sense that the sense of honor of the Arab was so strong. And of course, people have celebrated this jahiliyah quality in the old days. Now, of course, when Islam came, it addressed this psychological attitude of the Arab of the pre-Islamic period, because that sense of honor that was very strong among the Arabs of that time made it also possible for them to violate the women of the other tribe. And this could create a vendetta. And there was a lot of vendetta. The Italians also have this. It's still going on in Italy, in Sicily. If you mess up with our daughters or our sisters, we're going to fight your clan for the rest of your life. For 10, 20, 50, 100 years, we'll be fighting with you. The Arabs had that idea of vendetta. That is, if you mess with us, we will mess with you. And this will go intergenerationally. My sons will fight you, their sons will fight you, my great-grandson will fight your family for life. And of course, this has implication for the women. Because what it meant, since the women in the old societies were the most vulnerable, because they could be violated by the men, and this created problem of honor and shame for many of these Arabs. And that was one of the reasons why the Arabs did not like to have girls. Many of us would like to talk about, oh, they were burying the girls. There was a logic for it. Because if you live in a society where people like to save face, and the other side know that the only way they can always make you guys as a clan, as a group, lose face by messing up with one of your women, you lose face automatically. So naturally, you feel dishonored as a group, not as one family, as a clan. You are all dishonored because one of your women was violated. So for that reason, your clan will now begin to fight the other clan for life. Now, in order to minimize the risk and the tension, what happens? You now try to reduce your casualty rate. And in this case, the casualty is the female population. That was why they were burying their daughters. Because they will feel that if I have 5 daughters, chances are, the probabilities are, we will be shamed in our lifetime. But if I have 4 sons, 5 sons, no problem. That was the reason. That was why the Arabs wanted to have boys. And they were not very eager to have girls. Because especially when you are not in a position to defend their honor. That was the reason. Now when Islam came, it will change that whole psychology. Because when Islam came, Islam now began to tell the Arabs, change your focus. Don't have this ego business about our clan. Let us create a new sense of community for you. Don't focus on your tribe, on your clan. Focus on the ummah. You now have a new line of descent based on faith. So, a community of theological faith replaced a community of biological faith, F-A-T-E. The first one, F-A-I-T-H. A community of theological faith, meaning Islam, the Ummah, replaced a community built on biological links. Now, this is very important, and this is the most revolutionary development of Islam in human history, because Islam now begins to tell human beings, you may be a small family, you may have more girls than boys, but you will now have all these men who are Muslim who will protect your women. It creates a sense of security among the Arabs. Because now you don't have to have boys to be protected. You now have a whole clan of Muslims who will protect you. Because, and these people are not only committed to you in this dunya, they are committed to you in the akhirah. And they are willing to die for you because they know that there is an akhirah and they are standing for justice. That changed the relationship between man and woman. It changed the Arab attitude towards their women. It changed their attitude towards their daughters. So henceforth, you will no longer bury your daughters. In fact, your daughters now become very important in the community because your daughters now become the bridge between your family and the other families. Especially when they are virtuous women, because all the men in the whole ummah would like to come to this family because they are pious and responsible members of the community. So you can see the judo that the Prophet was able to play. You have a major psychological judo here. You use the strength of the jahiliyah against it to strengthen the ummah. Because now Arab pride is no longer channeled through warfare against each other through vendetta. Now Arab pride is now channeled towards being a mujahideen, a community of mujahideen who are willing to fight for the deen, who are willing to die for this community, to defend their women folks, to defend their property, to protect their deen, and all the other things. That was what the Prophet brought. And this changed the role and place of women in Islam. So you move from a jahiliyah way of looking at women to an Islamic way of looking at women. This was a major revolution in history. And I think many people who live in the West, especially Muslim women who are westernized, who don't understand their own intellectual history, miss this point that in Islam, one of the things that was done to affect the status, the role and status of the woman was to change the mindset of the males with regard to their daughters, their mothers, their sisters, and their wives to a new way of looking at themselves. Because now the men are being told that you men are garments for your wives and they are garments for you. In the past, they didn't see it that way. The women are just milestones around our neck because our dignity and our honor could really be drowned in this ocean of shame. But now, with Islam coming, the Arab of pre-Islamic Arabia was transformed to a man of nobility who takes pride in being the garment for his wife and his wife being the garment for him. And that he begins to protect the honor of the family, the honor of the ummah. That was a major revolution of the Prophet. And of course, most of this transformation which took place in Arabia would not be replicated in the other parts of the world until the 18th, 19th century. Because if you look at what happens in the biography of the Prophet ﷺ and the history of Islam, you will see that the status, the role and the status of the woman did not only change from what I described earlier to you, given those categories of relationships that existed under Jahiliyah, but with the Quranic revelation coming down and women being given the same status as the men with regard to divine injunctions as to what to do in terms of the 5 pillars and all the other responsibilities that Muslims are supposed to do, you now begin to see a change of attitude. Because what happens now is that the Muslims theologically were not to follow the footsteps of the Yahudi and the Nasrani with regard to their conception of women. Because in the Christian Bible and the Jewish Torah, women were made out of the rib of Adam. In the Quranic narrative, that's not true. Hawa was created separately from Adam. And Hawa is not the rib of Adam, as the Christians and Jews are told. So Allah made a separate creation, that was the woman. And of course, that theological narrative of the creation of Adam and his wife, Eve, would affect the role and status of women during the time of the Prophet. Because they too were part of that vice regency of the human being. Khalifatullah fil ars. You have that responsibility and that obligation, so you are responsible. And the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ made sure that this happened. Now, this immediately affects the relationship of the Prophet and those women who were living contemporaneously with him. The first example of the relationship between the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ and women folk in Arabia was the relationship he had with his wife Khadija bin Wahhaj. Khadija was 15 years older than the Prophet. The Prophet Muhammad was 25 years old, she was 40 years old. The Prophet was an employee of Khadija. We don't say that too much. Remember, he was younger and he was working for her. We don't like to say that. Many of the Muslim men don't even want to hear that. Some of the Muslim women don't want to hear that. They just want to do like this. We don't want to hear that. But that's part of the historical record. This was 15 years before he became a prophet. Take that into account. 15 years before he became a prophet, the Prophet Muhammad was working for this woman. He was an employee of his wife. And that's a point which Muslim men have to deal with, and Muslim women. We recognize the Prophet was exalted, he was the example, but he was a human being like all of us. 15 years is a long time. In America, many marriages don't last even 5 years. So they were living together as husband and wife in a monogamous relationship for 15 years before he became a prophet. Working for her. And that affects the example that he set for the other Muslims. After he became a prophet at age 40, he lived with this woman most of his time. This is where the Orientalists who say nasty things about the Prophet ﷺ, that he likes to marry women and all that. This man was a young man of 25. And he married this woman for 15 years before he became a prophet. And this woman stayed with him when he was over 50 years old. That's a fact, part of the historical record. So the relationship between the Prophet and his wife, Khadija, became a very useful example in the relationship between him and the Prophet. That's become very important. Second thing that is very important here when we look at the relationship between the Prophet and his wife Khadija is that his wife Khadija became a faithful supporter of the Prophet throughout his mission. She was well-to-do, and she did not only support him financially, but emotionally and psychologically. When the Prophet went to Mount Hira and he was confronted by Gabriel, he went to the household. Ya ayyuhal muzammil, ya ayyuhal muddathir. Who comforted her? Him, when he was in that period. It was his wife. So that also changed the nature of the relationship. Now, in the Western literature, you will see many of these Orientalists who will say, well, he married all these women. But if you look at the Prophet, he married only after the death of Khadija. And he was in his 50s. And now you all live together today, you know that. Many of the men, by the time they're 50 years old, so the Prophet Muhammad, so when people, in the West, they try to emphasize this side of the Prophet, they don't do justice to the man. He did not marry any other woman until the death of Khadija. And those women he married, like Hafsa, Aisha, Safiya, the Jewish girl, Maryam from Egypt, all these women came into his life as widows who needed protection, and the Prophet contracted political marriages. Even some of his opponents who write against him in the feminist literature acknowledge that fact, that these were not young girls. Aisha was the young one. But all the others were married before So really, the relationship between the Prophet and these wives serve as model for Muslim men after him. And it explained the relationship between man and woman that existed in Arabia before Islam, and how those errors of jahiliyah were to be corrected. And the Prophet set a good example in correcting the excesses and the blunders of jahiliyah days. Now, the other point that needs to be understood here with regard to the role and place of women during the time of the Prophet is the fact that women in the immediate house of the Prophet were not only psychological, moral, and emotional supporters of the Prophet, as we know from the stories about the wives of the Prophet, and you have thousands of books written about them, you can see that they became role models for other women in the Islamic tradition, and they were called the mothers of the believers. The other example that existed was the relationship between the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ and his daughter Fatimah. He had other daughters, Kulsum and others, but Fatimah is more widely celebrated in the literature. And of course, Fatimah has been elevated, especially in the Shia tradition, to a higher status by Shia Muslims, but she is also revered by Sunni Muslims, women. Now, the relationship that was established between the Prophet ﷺ and his daughter was a very loving relationship. All fathers who have daughters should try to emulate the Prophet in the manner in which he related to his daughter Fatima. And that becomes a useful and a powerful example for Muslim men who have daughters, and they can learn from the Prophet in relating to their daughter. Because you have many hadiths which say that the Prophet would get up the moment Fatima is coming, and he will kiss her and put her next to him. Now, many Muslim men, they like to keep their daughters even away. I mean, like the relationship is not very embracing and encouraging to some of the girls because they may feel aloof. But if you look at the seerah and you look at the relationship that existed between the Prophet and his daughter, you see this loving affection between father and daughter. And of course, Fatima was so much beloved to her father that she didn't live long after the death of her father. Within a 6-month period after the Prophet passed away, she too died. She must have been emotionally devastated by the death of her father, the Prophet Muhammad ibn Abdullah. Now, there were other women who were contemporaries of the Prophet, and the relationship that existed between the Prophet and this woman also affected. Of course, Aisha, the wife of the Prophet, the daughter of Abu Bakr, was another important figure in the history of Islam. And of course, when Muslim biographers talk about her, they give her credit on a number of fronts. She reported a number of hadith. We know intimate details about the Prophet's household life from her. A lot of the things that we now know as to what the Prophet did with regard to man-woman relations came from her. And of course, Aisha was also a person who represented this new woman of post-Islamic Arabia, which made her different from the women of jahiliyah days. And Muslims who are interested in understanding the role and place of women in the time of the Prophet should study the biography of Aisha thoroughly so as to learn more about the sociological, psychological, cultural and historical conditions that existed in Arabia at the time of the Prophet. Beside Aisha, you have people like Hafsa, Salama, and others. All these women did affect the Prophet. You remember during the time of Hudaybiyah, when the Muslims went in full force hoping to go into the Kaaba and perform the rituals, but they were stopped at the edges of the city by Abu Sufyan and the other leaders of Mecca. And of course, there was a lot of confusion among the Muslims. It was one of the wives of the Prophet who advised him to go and slaughter his animal. And then, of course, Ali followed suit, and then the other Sahabas who were really in a state of confusion at that time because they were very much down the role and place of the woman. A woman in the house of the Prophet became a source of inspiration and encouragement for him at that time. This is in the Hadith literature. Now, when we look at the role and place of women during the time of the Prophet, we can move outside of the household of the Prophet, and we now begin to look at other women who existed contemporaneously with the Prophet. We have the case of Waraqah, who has been used now in the West. She has begun to be discovered from obscurity, and you have debates among some of the Muslims whether women should be that or should not be that. And of course, Waraqah is sometimes quoted. The hadith about her is brought into the discussion as to the role and place of women at the time of the Prophet and the examples of some of those women for contemporary Muslim women. Now, she enters the literature in this context. This was the woman who was told by the Prophet that she could lead her household in prayer. And in her household, you had a boy, you had a girl, and of course you have a muezzin, who must be a man. And the idea is, here you have a woman who could lead prayers and stand in front of a boy who is a man. And of course, we have people now in America, people like Kawkab Siddiqui and others, who will use that hadith and say, on the basis of this hadith, which is a true hadith, women should lead prayers. But of course, the ulama who are familiar with this hadith knew that this was a particular incident, a particular case. You cannot use that particular case and make a generalization that women are eligible to lead prayers. And of course, this is how Kawkab Siddiqui has been criticized by many of our contemporary scholars of fiqh and students of the Sharia, because you're taking an isolated case, an isolated hadith, where a woman is given authority by the Prophet to lead prayer and try to make a universal case out of it. But the case of Waraqah is part of our history, part of the relationship between women and men, and part of the example set by the Prophet. Now, women played many other roles in the life of the emerging Islamic community in Mecca and in Medina. Now, if you look at the women's role in Mecca, when the Muslims were very small as a community, you can see the courageous role that was played by some of these Muslim women. We already talked about Khadija, bankrolling the Prophet, serving as comforter, consoler, emotional support for the Prophet. But we also have to remember when the Islamic movement was underground and they used to meet in the house called Darul Arqam, which was an underground cell of the Muslims. Arqam owned property around the Kaaba. And Muslims used to meet in his house. It was an underground, what they call now in America a safe house. When you have an underground movement, they have a safe house. And Darul Arqam was a safe house, an underground cell for the Muslims. And of course, you know the revelation. Let me wrap up quickly. You know the story about the sister of Umar bin Khattab, who was part of that Darul Arqam underground. And of course, she became a Muslim secretly, unbeknown to Umar. That time Umar was not a Muslim. And Umar was one day very determined to go and kill the Prophet. And he was so enraged and so determined to go and do that. But on the way, because he knew about this Darul Arqam underground, so as he was heading towards Darul Arqam, someone told him, "You want to get Muhammad? You better go and fix your sister. She's a Muslim." Umar was very enraged. So he rushed towards the sister's house. And when he got there, they were already reciting Surah Taha. He overheard what was being read. So when he got inside the house, the sister, the husband, and another Sahaba who were reciting the Qur'an were accosted, and of course the brother-in-law was attacked to the point that blood was coming out. And his sister, Umar's sister, tried to separate him from the from the husband. And of course, Umar bin Khattab insisted that he wanted to see what they were reciting. The sister refused to give him the text because they say, "You are not a Muslim. You have to be cleansed." So he went and he cleaned himself, and then he came back. They gave him the ayat of Surah Taha they were reciting. Umar was so overwhelmed by this ayat that he rushed to Darul Arqam. And of course, Muslims were suspicious of him. And Hamza stood between him and the Prophet and said, "If you want to get in, to kill him, I finish you first." The Prophet moved him away from Umar. And Umar came in and submitted to Islam. Now this shows you that the Muslim women were actively involved in that revolutionary cell as the men. Because Umar's sister preceded him in Islam. So his sister was a Muslim before him. And you know Umar is now a great hero among Muslims. But how many Muslims know the sister? That's history. That's what happened to movements. Sometimes the people who come into the movement first are forgotten. And those who come later are more recognized. And this happened to the sister of Umar. Because there are very few Muslims who know the sister's name, or this story I just narrated. Now, the point I'm making here is that during the formative stage of Islam, the women were actively involved. And this was carried over into Medina, where the Muslims were more secure, more powerful, more numerous, and more prestigious as a community. And in Medina, the Muslim women came to the mosque, something that many of us don't want to deal with today. They went to the mosque. And we see remnants of that in the Haram today. If you go to Medina and you go to Mecca for Hajj, the women are in the Haram. But today we have in the mosque some Muslims who say women should not come for Jummah prayer. And of course they have a basis for saying it because some of our medieval scholars say that. But the seerah of the Prophet the events happening at the time of the Prophet, during the Hajj, the women go for Hajj. And in the Kaaba, they are there with the men. And some of you here maybe went for Hajj, and you saw that with your eyes. So these are some of the issues. I mean, I can speak for 2 hours again, but we don't have time. And I'm being signaled that time is running out. I can speak for 2 more hours on this issue. But I hope that I give you enough history, because I always like to contextualize things, so that when we look at the Prophet, we just don't look at it in isolation. These are just something that you read in yellow books, yellow pages, and it's just isolated. We have to relate the seerah to the present, so that Muslim men and women who talk to Americans, Canadians, and English women who are feminists, you can argue with them because you know your history, and you can relate to the concepts that are now. But if we just look at the seerah as something that happened 1400 years ago, and we just read about it, we mummify the Prophet. We don't want to mummify the Prophet and the Sahabas. We want them to be alive. We want them to be examples to us. But if you mummify them and you keep them in the past, then the Prophet is not alive. You put him in cold storage. Anything that you put in the refrigerator is frozen. We want the Prophet to be alive, so that his example is alive. And then we can challenge those people who are feminists. Some of them are lesbian and gay, who challenge the Muslims. And we can challenge them too, intellectually. But if we mummify the Prophet, we mummify the women who were with him, they can't speak, they can't talk. They're gone, but they are alive, because their example is in us. And this is the point I wanted to communicate. Assalamu alaikum.